Good evening. By looking at the title of my discussion tonight, you can imagine that we're going to talk about a few things, but mostly about money, status, privilege, and power. And those topics usually for people either fascinate them or aggravate them. So we'll try to look more at the aggravation side, by the way, and discuss maybe the condition of the world economy as I speak. Now, of course, before we talk about today, we have to look at the past. And I'm sure everybody loves history here, right? This is a college campus. I'm wrong about that. But if you read history, you may notice that probably the most influential corporation was something called the East India Corporation, which was around 400 years ago, essentially was pretty much a dominant monopoly-like trading company. And they did most of their business, obviously, in parts of Asia. Now, they weren't a corporation like we really think about it today. Yes, they made a lot of money, but essentially they weren't very good to their customers. Let's say they came to your town, your city, or your country, and you refused to do business with them. What would happen, do you think? Well, they had a private army and a private navy, and they'd force you to buy their stuff. Very nice, right? Well, to make a long story short, we had something called the Industrial Revolution, which kind of made those business practices obsolete. And then the real reason was they were mercantilists and not really creating much at all. So let's get down to the basics. Now, when you think of capitalism and its contributions, if you may put that in that way, you may not think of the modern corporation as one of them. You may think of the electricity bulb, you may think of airplanes or televisions. But these happened because a lawyer in Britain about 150 years ago devised a legal structure which allowed companies to be formed, grow, and invite in outside investments and investors known as shareholders. And the end result, of course, was globalization. And a lot of the famous entities in the world are these large companies. And today, innovation is a driving force behind what these groups are doing. But now let's look at more the, if not the dark side, the more the hidden side of these companies and what they entail. Now, as you all know today, we have this problem in the world known as an income distribution problem. And it's not difficult to see this. If you read a business magazine, there are many stories about these ultra-rich people who have tens of billions of dollars. And I'm pretty sure the mythical King Midas would probably be green with envy if you saw how much money they controlled. But the question is, how did these people amass such wealth? Well, most of them, of course, were founders of companies and later, in theory, sold them to the general public and outside investors. Now, this system is not new. It's been around, as I said, for over 100 years. If we went back a century, we would see that the most famous or dominant figure was a guy called Henry Ford. And I'm sure you know who he is. He's the guy who invented, really, modern manufacturing. Let's go back today. We have a new figure, Mark Zuckerberg, household name, as we know, the person behind Facebook. And they have many things in common. They are innovators, risk-takers, very driven people, and visionaries. What did Henry Ford do for us? Well, basically, he gave the masses personalized and customized transportation. What did Facebook give? He gave the masses personalized and customized communication systems. But there's another thing that these two people share. It's a curious affinity or love of something called a dual-class share. The suspense is killing us, right? There you go. Well, the dual-class share means this basically. If you buy the share of a company, you may think every share is the same, but they're not. They have these super shares that are not traded in the stock market. You cannot go to a broker to buy it. These are under the domain of usually the founding members or people of the firm. And this gives people special privileges. If you have one of these shares, you have 10 times the power in the firm. What does this mean? You can basically have the board of directors elected and also have the CEO, which is the company's managers, appointed by yourself. And this is interesting because when someone sells a company, yes, they should receive tons of money. That's not a problem. The problem is they're selling the company, but guess what? They're keeping control of it. So why does this happen? Well, most people don't know it exists. And essentially, if you look at the Ford Motor Company, it's an ancient company. Today, who controls it? The great-great-grandkids of good old Henry Ford. So if we consider that capitalism should be based on a meritocracy, this is more like a royalty, right? Where people are given money and power just because they're the ancestors of successful people. And one could ask, should there be a limit to privilege, especially in a modern society where education in theory should be the driving force behind success in the long run? But there's even a more interesting story to be told about what's happening in the world. If you follow the press, you'll notice that people are questioning the wealth of companies. Now, we know that big companies have big advantages. Economies of scale, scope, they can get cheap labor, they can get smart people, and many other such issues. But one of the big benefits, guess what, is paying taxes to governments, both their own governments and other governments which they do business with. About 10, 15 years ago, I was in a social event, and I was mingling with the crowd. Sometimes I do that, by the way. And there was this well-dressed fellow I bumped into, and we entered into a conversation. And at the beginning, of course, you exchange niceties, and then what happens gradually, people ask what you do for a living. I told him about what I did. He wasn't impressed. I don't blame him, actually, right? But that said, he turned out to be an auditor in a large international, multinational, international accounting firm. So I asked him, what do you do every day? Because I kind of find accounting to be boring. He lit up and he said, well, I help my clients avoid taxes. I said, wow, this guy's very honest. He said, no, calm down. It is not evading taxes, he said, it is avoiding it. And I said, aha, I'll learn something tonight. So for 2 minutes, he told me his great activities on his daily job. And I went home that night and said, well, that was enlightening. I forgot about it. But a few years later, those activities that he was conducting became pretty much mainstream. And let's look at the world today. The richest of the rich is Apple, right? And if I asked you how much money does Apple have in the bank, no one really gives me the right answer. I'll tell you what it is. $190 billion in the bank. It's a lot of money, right? So the question is, how did that happen? We know great products, great designs, great Apple stores, and a huge system behind them. But one big reason, I must say, is the way the company uses tax avoidance. Now, how does this work? Here I said some simple accounting practices. Not that simple, by the way, but I'll give you a basic example. Let's go to a high-tax country, which is France, right? France is known for good food and high taxes. Now, that said, what happens when you sell a product in France, Apple sells iPhones, all the money is transferred to Ireland. Why is that? Because Ireland has low taxes, about 12%. So the companies show no profits in these high-tax countries and push it to Luxembourg and to Ireland. This, by the way, is totally legal, though it may question or test your moral sensibilities. Now, and a lot of people now are being somewhat aggravated about how this is happening, because Apple pays 14% of their percent tax income. Now that tax rate is pretty much similar to a secretary or a truck driver. Put that into perspective. Now, why do we have this situation? Because people say, governments are incompetent and greedy, and they try to suck money out of companies. What can a company do? They have these gimmicks to lower the tax, their tax burden. And there's some truth to these arguments. It's called supply-side economics of the benefits of low taxes. What is this? A rich company, rich person, if the taxes are high, they don't invest because they are demoralized. It's not worth their time and effort. On the flip side, this will lead to bad events. If there's less investment, there's less jobs. So then poor people and middle-class people are hurt as well by this. But recently, people are not really buying this level of inequity and equality that is surfacing in the global arena. And last summer, I was visiting the United States, traveled around a lot, and I went to a few bookstores, and I noticed that a lot of middle-class, educated Americans were reading a book, a big fat book, by the way. The name of the book was called Capital in the 21st Century. Originally, it was written in 2013 by a French academic called Thomas Piketty. Because it was written in French, no one read it, okay? It was then made in English translation. It became international bestseller. And that guy basically complains about the growing inequality in the world, and he kind of says it's structural. So this is interesting. We have Americans reading a French lefty and seeing to enjoy what he's writing as well. And you can see that if we have people who benefit from the system or questioning it, this obviously can cause problems in the future. Now, that said, how can we overcome these problems? They didn't accrue in one night. Now, you could say, well, simple idea, make the tax code much more simple to prevent companies to take advantage of the whole system. Now, this may seem a bit shocking, but if you went to the United States and looked at the tax code means the regulations and the descriptions. It's 70,000 pages long, 70,000. In my whole life, I haven't read that many, I don't think, pages, right? 70,000 pages of tax stuff. And why is it like this way? For obvious reasons. It creates lots of loopholes. Loophole is a system that gives a benefit to a certain person, group, sector, or company. This, of course, is legal. It's done around the world by many of these respected, developed governments and their economies. So you probably would need some international cooperation. What does that mean? You've heard of the G20, right? Which are the major economies in the world. It includes most of the large groups. They also put South Africa in there to have an African representation. Now, that said, you'd also need the EU, probably the OECD, to work things out. You would also need other stakeholders, like NGOs and tax advocates, and also maybe the tax companies to come and discuss how this can become made a more feasible issue and a more equitable out there. Now, for this to happen, would need a lot of political will. And we can imagine that governments would not like to give up sovereignty because a joint tax regime would mean your government will lose lots of levers, and that's a big topic by itself. Other issues, of course, would deal with the corporations fighting back. We call this lobbying. Lobbying is a funny word. Some people say it's part of bribery, but there are different shades of this as well. And the other problem, of course, is all those famous accountants and lawyers. Well, they have no job, right? And what will happen to them? We should have some mercy on them as well. Now, all of these things, of course, could be solved. The other issue I talked about, Facebook and the Ford Motor Company. The reason why we have these dual class shares, they say, is to give stability for firms. So when the founder sells his shares, he should stay there to make things don't get out of hand. Well, that could be an argument which could be acceptable. I do agree with that. But let's put a time limit on it. So after maybe 20 or 30 years, this system is not perpetuated, and so their offspring and grandkids and whatnot will not receive the same benefits they got. So we could end it pretty simple. That, for me, is quite straightforward. So as we see today, a lot of educated young people think the system is rigged. When I mean rigged, it's unfair, it's unequitable. And this is not very good for the social fabric in any country. And in a while, people, if they question the legitimacy of the social, economic, financial, and cultural policies of the ruling class, and in history, the results have not been very good or very nice if you look throughout history. So reform probably it would be necessary because maybe in the next 10, 20 years, the system will not be sustainable, especially for the companies. Forget the average man or woman in the street. So, of course, you could, if you're a cynic, you would tell me that, quoting Shakespeare, this is nothing important, much ado about nothing. I'm wasting our time. This is the world. And you should say face reality because globalization is a trend that no one, force, can reverse. And there's some claims that this is something that no group, person will able to fix as I speak. But that said, if we tie this back to the theme of tonight's discussion, it was, I believe, simplify. Sorry, there he goes. Simplify here. So if we simplified a lot of these financial rules and made it more transparent, I believe everyone would benefit, both the ultra-rich, the companies and the people, and the non-ultra-rich who would believe the system is transparent, equitable, and more fair. Thank you for listening to me. Good night.